everyone. I'm Madhuri Rao, Assistant Professor at RVCA Bangalore. Thank you for your participation. I'm sure there'll be more who'll join us in a couple of minutes. We concluded a wonderful session yesterday with Aliya Rizvi, Mansi Rao, and Shrajana Kaikini, and are back today for our second session with Kush Patel, Arzu, Mistry, and Swati, Janu. A little about our symposium. The seeds of this symposium were sown at an ongoing elective me and my colleague Salila Vanka co-teach at RVCA called Architectural Research Methods for 8th semester students. In our bid to expose our very enthusiastic students to creative research methods, we drew up a wish list of our speakers of both sessions and presented it to our principal, who was very encouraging and suggested we share this dialogue with a much larger audience, and hence we find ourselves here. The premise for the symposium is that in an increasingly interconnected world, we see boundaries between disciplines as porous and related. In our two sessions, we seek to explore 6 different trajectories of research methods, exposing and highlighting process over product. We hope to uncover the layers of appropriations and nuances of finding a research method. Moreover, this event is also a platform for students and young professionals of architecture and allied disciplines to engage with the idea of research as practice of their profession, where research informs practice and practice reinforces research. Our program for the day is that we will have one of our students, Anjali, introducing our speakers, followed by their presentation and a question to follow that up. We would have 3 such presentations, after which Archita Bandopadhyay, Assistant Professor at RVCA, has graciously agreed to be a moderator for the day. And with that, I'd like to start for the day. For the audience, just a couple of instructions. Please keep your mics on mute. Also, please key in your questions, which we could ask the speakers in the question and answers box. If it is at the bottom, so there's a triangle, square, and circle icon at the bottom right-hand side corner of your screen. If you click over that, you could see Q&A. So if you could key in your questions there, and rather than on chat, so that we can keep track of the questions more efficiently. Over to you, Anjali. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. The first speaker for the day is Dr. Kush Patel. They are the co-founder of Pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed, a digital humanities collective committed to anti-colonial digital research and pedagogy. They have held academic appointments at Avni Institute of Design near Calicut in Kerala, as well as the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, which is also the institution where they earned their PhD in architecture. They have taught seminars on place and power and on spatial agencies in architecture at academic institutions in India and the US. They've developed critical pedagogy initiatives in the context of architecture and anti-colonial, queer, and feminist digital humanities within and beyond these networks. Their writing appears in peer-reviewed journals such as the Digital Studies. Most recently, they have also produced a co-authored chapter for the book Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Science Through Critical Race Theory, published by the MIT Press. They also co-edited volume on gender and academic leadership in architecture in India research proceedings from Avni Institute of Design. We're thrilled to have you with us, Dr. Patel. I now invite you to present your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I do wish to acknowledge that at the time of presenting this paper, we would be 15 months into the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last few months especially, many of us might have lost someone known or known to those of us in our networks. Losses are hard, and those resulting from callousness make them difficult to grieve. So thank you to symposium coordinators Salila Vanka and Madhuri Rao for convening us with such care during this time. To members of the RV College of Architecture for having me and for providing this opportunity to share space with brilliant co-panelists Arzu, Mistry, and Swati, Janu. I look forward to a collective listening and learning today. I'd also like to mention that there's a live captioning feature on Google Meet as well for anyone wishing to turn it on and access our talk thusly. Relational critiques. As a Savarna queer feminist educator and public scholar working at the intersections of architectural history theory, environmental design studies, and the digital humanities, my research and teaching remain united by a shared interest in the analysis of socially just infrastructures. Infrastructures understood as relational embodiments of a place, inscribing minoritized bodies and material histories, and as scaffolds of community-engaged knowledge creation in and with the digital. This approach has enabled me to move the historical and theoretical analyses of architecture, space, and the city from critique to praxis, as well as work collaboratively, coalitionally, and pedagogically to envision spatial futures with both academic and non-academic partners. I remain grateful to many people, programs, fellowships, and institutions from Michigan to Kerala that have supported this praxis and helped to materialize it as public scholarship. Engaged research in architecture is often cast either as building discourse through deep archival study and fieldwork, or as building critique through making, involving tactical interventions that address specific needs to refigure aspects of community life. The identity of an engaged researcher, however, as an expert figure, filling knowledge gaps, reversing established conventions, furthering new methodologies, or generating new theories to explain the world, is often tethered to the ideal of giving something back to communities who make this life possible. Indigenous studies scholars remain critical of this ideal. With reference to its colonial and imperial legacies, Linda Tuhiwai Smith called research a dirty word. In her 1999 book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, she writes, and I quote, "But belief in the ideal that benefiting mankind is indeed a primary outcome of scientific research is as much a reflection of ideology as it is of academic training. It becomes so taken for granted that many researchers simply assume that they as individuals embody this ideal and are natural representatives of it when they work with other communities," end quote. Her task for us, non-Indigenous researchers, was then to critique this assumed and inherited ideal and the methodologies that those assumptions often produce and reproduce. My work has taken up this task in the act of positioning myself, in challenging power disparities in the research process itself, and in building solidarities with and within collectives whose relationship to research as knowledge production is not about giving back, as if something was extracted or stolen in the first place, but rather about radical survival. My work has taken up this task in and through a scholarly praxis of survival. So I'll begin sharing my slides. Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, Kush.
Great, thank you. So I'll begin with an image. This photo was taken 3 years ago with the permission of Jerry and Billy Hebron at the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm in Detroit's North End district. To study the participatory process of land stewardship, food production, and community development in everyday life and urban history, I began to research to understand 3 things. 1, how might community gardens, distinct in their constitutive politics of race, gender, and class, function as participatory spaces in support of the residents' right to the city? 2, how might acts of gardening negotiate concerns of risk and promise, capital and labor, legal and extra-legal frameworks towards sustaining inclusive and renewed urban futures? And 3, how might we work with this combined knowledge to reflect on the roles played by architecture and space in those community-centered practices? Until as late as 1960s, the city's North End was a remarkable place, kept vibrant with African American and Jewish community life, businesses and business ownerships, bars, clubs, and worship homes. By the 1980s, however, the district began to decline through planned disinvestments in the city and a steady population flight. The farm itself, covering a total of 4.8 acres, came out of a program of the North End CDC, a nonprofit faith-based organization that was founded in 1999 by Reverend Bertha L. Carter, Hebron's mother, who, as Natasha Tallman, the farm's program coordinator, shares, and I quote, had a vision of care for the North End community, which began by providing food to individuals who were food insecure in that area out of the trunk of her car. That vision morphed into a nonprofit organization that not only provided programs in youth development, economic development, and community development capacities, but also merged art, architecture, and culture at the intersection of providing sustainability in the North End community, end quote. I began by undertaking a series of visits, interviews, and immersives with community members, collectives, activists, and scholars working in this area, each of whom collectively and slowly constituted my access into the district and this farm. Approaching Jerry as a privileged outsider and foreigner affiliated with a university in a fraught relationship with the city was a difficult proposition. Through a series of phone calls and meetings, I, and subsequently we, began laying bare our different histories, locations, and power. But it was in shared questions of gender and labor that we found ourselves connecting the most. I was a non-binary queer femme person, an Indian with caste privilege and intergenerational wealth that had facilitated my access to higher education in India and the US. My work carried the voice of my mother, who couldn't access university education herself, but whose brilliance and everyday feminism had made my academic life both meaningful and possible. I was a postdoctoral fellow, thinking about forms that campus community projects might take to engage specific lives and infrastructural struggles in the deeply unequal and violent contexts of racism in southeastern Michigan. My research was integrated with pedagogy, through which Jerry, Billy, other members of the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, Natasha, my students, and I collaboratively practiced the ethics and politics of augmenting stories of participation with each other and with digital media. The research seminar that comprised and followed these engagements in winter of 2018 stood transformed. The course, entitled The Plot Beneath the Garden, enabled us to build community as a classroom, where we listened to each other, engaged with our partners' stories, and placed them in conversation with a range of theoretical and historical perspectives on space, politics, and justice. We studied these accounts. We discussed how our farm partners were imagining the city for themselves and their communities, and the extent to which they were building an infrastructure to support those visions through agriculture, art, and architecture. By interconnecting lived insights and academic scholarship, we went past the rhetoric of community gardening as a harmonious imperative and examined how this practice might be social, but also deeply political. One of the most important research ethics we modeled was to position ourselves as interlocutors between a national level archive and transformative work on the ground. The term plot in the project title The plot beneath the garden was a deliberate play on the very physical character of a plot of land and the narrative or story underneath plots that we wanted to collectively unearth and make visible for the Smithsonian Institution's Community of Gardens Digital Public Archive. I and we took care to not speak for the community, care to ensure that the Digital Public Archive that the class was engaging was not merely a site to upload stories to, but rather a project to examine critically. How is it made? Who is it made for? Whose stories are part of the archive and why? Whose stories might still be missing from the archive and why? Throughout this work, my students and I did not want to take away our partners' right to access the site and upload narratives in their own voice. Instead, we worked with oral narrations, oral histories, engaged with the digital archive critically, and opened that archive in ways that a wider set of participants could find themselves in and with it. I'm inclined to call this work public scholarship rather than research, or as I stated at the start of this talk, a scholarly praxis of survival. In describing her research with the Latino community of Southwest Detroit, Chicana feminist scholar and professor Maria Cotera writes, and I quote, "My work with the Latino community of Southwest Detroit has never been about professional advancement. It has been about survival, theirs and mine. In and through our exchange, I work to heal the split between the places where I first developed the desire to know and the places that shape the desire into authorized ways of knowing," end quote. My work carries this reminder to heal the split and confront the expectations of standard scientific research within the academy, expectations that flatten out the lived contradictions of class, caste, gender, and education among minoritized groups, distancing us from our own kin and backgrounds. Equally, my scholarship remains structured around Linda Tuhiwai Smith's call for an explicitly self-reflective, relational, and anti-colonial action. Lest her critiques return us to this trope of giving back rather than talking back at ideals and assumptions that extract and exploit. Over the last 3 years, as founding lead of Pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed Collective with colleagues Dr. Ashley Caranto-Morford and Arun Jacob, I've been able to learn, practice, and reflect on these lessons within cross-disciplinary design and digital humanities frameworks, to reconceptualize how research and teaching in the arts, humanities, and design might destabilize colonial ideologies that are naturalized within our interconnected scholarly practices. This partnership is named after and centered around Paulo Freire's writings on the pedagogy of the oppressed, wherein Freire discusses pedagogy as a political tool and practice commonly used for domination. Our partnership cites the knowledges and lived consciousness of our own and those of our collaborators and wider scholars to unveil what Freire called the reality of oppression, both as we see it and as it is framed for us. We keep in mind that Freire's work was a deeply concrete research project and an explicitly anti-colonial praxis. As such, we remain mindful of the connections between critique and praxis and remain committed to making visible the stakes of this undertaking. The question of land and community are at the heart of our research, starting with an acknowledgement of how Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ2IA+, disabled, and class and caste oppressed communities have long raised awareness to and challenged the colonialism, neoliberalism, and imperialism embedded in mainstream land-based and community-centered research. Most recently, even as we shared our work with participating researchers, community members, and educators at the just concluded Digital Humanities Summer Institute in colonially called Victoria, we acknowledged how many of us were connecting with one another from various sovereign Indigenous lands, that many of the digital infrastructures we use are built on Indigenous lands, remain inaccessible to Indigenous communities, and our responsibilities to Indigenous lands and life extend into the digital realm. This act of acknowledgement returns us to Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's task for us, especially those of us not from Indigenous communities, to make explicit what Maria Cotera has called the messy collaborations and dialogues, the delicate networking between multiple domains of power, the inevitable translational practices that make one's scholarly research legible to the community and vice versa, one's community work legible to the academy, end quote. I myself was joining then, as I'm joining now, from my current location in Gujarat, where the Adivasi community of the Beals continue to suffer alienation from bureaucratic labelings and seizing of land and forest resources, and where the COVID-19 deaths remain one of the highest, but also among the most underreported in the country. These are relational critiques. Thank you for listening.
Kush, thank you so much for that thought-provoking talk, and problematizing the idea of the researcher and the position of research, and the role of research itself in this whole. As you said, I think it's something we always tussle with, right? As in, where do I locate myself? And I think when all of us who actually done some fieldwork at some point and engaged with communities that have not had the privileges that some of us have had, it becomes a very difficult question. Very recently, someone was asking, someone had come to give a talk, and a colleague was asking that person, how do I position myself? When I go to interview someone, they want to know what I'm going to be able to do for them. And it puts the researcher in a very delicate situation. I think Swati also might have faced it, and Arzu, to the others that have worked with research, as to, where do you locate yourself? And are you even in a position to kind of commit to anything? So I know that's what you were getting at. So would you like to elaborate a little more in your own field work when you were working with the communities in Detroit and around Ann Arbor? Would you like to talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So thanks, Salila. I think your question kind of harkens back to even those questions of whether you're an outsider or an insider, or how are you giving back? It comes back to this trope of giving back, which has long been held as a kind of a immoral and a social position in engaged research, something that you give back to the communities because that's what makes it mutually beneficial. Yeah. But for communities for whom it's a matter of not just a lived reality, but of survival, it becomes very important, as has been for me, to be able to take time, acknowledge the locations, the histories, and the powers that we come with, and start blunting them in ways that honors trust. And that process takes time. And that process has multiple directions to it, which does not lend itself to a very clear-cut linear research process either. And so I think if our questions are not about what am I giving back to the community, but the questions are what is this project and how is it leading to co-liberation? Then you're able to sort of locate yourself with stakes that are equal, if not higher, than those who are experiencing that as a lived reality. And that becomes a point of connect for you to understand that matters of oppression are interlinked. And it's a matter of us acknowledging, voicing that out very clearly to be able to then say, these are the ways in which this research is not a research as it's defined by the scholar, but it's a collective project that is going to lend itself to processes, policies, change-making in the world that ultimately is of use, benefit, and a kind of a liberated experience for all of us. So I think that honesty of positionality matters, but also continuously working on it and being very mindful of the kinds of methods that we elect. So let's not jump into, let's look at ethnography, because ethnography itself has a long colonial history to how it turned indigenous populations into objects of research enough to then be documented and then serve the interests of those in the academy towards their promotion and tenure. So there's a long history to violence in and through certain field methods. And so any kind of a revision requires us to revisit some of those genealogies and to be able to sort of revise, tweak, and generate new ways of trusting methods that help to answer the question that we're asking, but it's a question that we've also collectively formulated. Yeah.
That just raised a lot more questions that I want to ask, but I think we'll keep that for the end. Thanks so much, Kush.
Thank you. Thanks, Lila.
And I'd invite Anjali to introduce our next speaker.
Our next speaker is architect Swati Janu. She is an architect, artist, and writer based in Delhi. Her work engages with housing rights, migration, and urban informality, combining community engagement and activism with policy advocacy. She is the founder of the interdisciplinary design practice Social Design Collaborative, which was recently awarded the Beasley Design of the Year 2020 in architecture for building modular low-cost schools. She has presented on inclusive and sustainable development across global platforms, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in Edmonton, Canada, to the South-South Forum on Sustainability at Hong Kong. In 2018, she was nominated as one of the 15 young leaders from India by the Franco-Indian Trust for her efforts in humanitarian architecture. A graduate from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, Swati holds a Master's in Sustainable Urban Development from University of Oxford, UK, and currently teaches at Ambedkar University in Delhi. We're very happy to have you with us. I now invite you to present your talk, ma'am.
Thanks, Anjali, and thanks, Alila, for the invite, and Kush for that really important and powerful lecture before this. I'm going to share my screen. Can someone confirm? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. In our team, we like to think of the work we do as a slow practice. For us, research and practice are intertwined, really. It's incremental. Everything happens, slowly. It evolves step by step. It's iterative. We try lots of different things. Not all of them work. And it's interdisciplinary. Now, this is very important for us, that we don't work only with designers and architects and creative practitioners. It's important for us that we work with human rights lawyers, sociologists, activists, social workers, academics. And that, I feel, is just important in any field, really, that we don't stick to our silos. There is so much to learn, like Kush was saying, and the work is so much richer. So most of the work that we do is in what are technically called informal settlements or self-organized settlements. A lot of them are commonly called slums, which is a word we avoid using. We use the word basti more often. It's Hindi for self-grown neighborhoods. Another word could be homegrown neighborhoods that URBS has come up with. And most of our work falls in these neighborhoods simply because, we feel that planning processes, not just we feel, it is true that planning processes don't cover informal neighborhoods. And we feel that designers and architects don't typically work in these neighborhoods. And so inherently, if you think about it, architecture is a very elitist profession, because most of the people who have access to design, just fall within, let's say, 1% of our country's population. And most of the people in our cities don't have access to the services of an architect, an engineer, a designer. And these are also settlements which are often evicted. There's a lot of violence which they are subjected to. In Delhi itself, there have been hundreds of evictions in the last few decades. This is a story of an eviction, a narrative which was drawn by students from CEPT. I heard there's a lot of representation from CEPT today. So you'd be happy to see this work that they had come up with. This was in 2017, and I'll get into the details of the workshop towards the end. But this is just to show you what really goes into, this sort of eviction, which is usually illegal and forced. And usually you should get a notice of 30 days, but there's hardly a 1 day or a 2 day notice that that communities get. And it was because of one such eviction in 2011 that we got in touch with the farming communities along the river Yamuna in Delhi. And a school had been demolished in one such demolition drive. So representatives of the community from Yamuna Khadar, they approached me and they asked me if we could help them rebuild the school and help them design it in such a way that it could be dismantled before it could be demolished. It had to be temporary because they'd gotten permission from the High Court to rebuild it as long as it was temporary. But it had to be dismantled within a day, considering they'd get a day's notice before any other eviction took place. So for a young professional, because I was much younger then, this is a very powerful and a challenging brief to take up. And so in the typical design research fashion, I started looking at, with Nidhi Sohane, who's a colleague, I started looking at how people are already building there, what are the materials they use, what are the details, so to say. And so bamboo, reuse, wood, river wheat, these are the kind of materials that the farmers were using to build their own houses. And some really creative details, such as, this cycle tire half embedded in the ground to pull down the tarpaulin to hold that down over the house. And I'm not going to go into the design or the process of it too much, because I really want to talk about what happened after that. This was a starting point for us in so many ways. It was also the first project for Social Design Collaborative. It helped me sort of see the need for such an organization, because what happened is this little school or building of the school became a larger movement. It snowballed as more and more people started joining us. Because as we were designing it, we also started helping in the fundraising, and lots of volunteers, lots of students, lots of young designers wanted to be a part of something like this. And I think that's also, it says a lot about our education system, and there's not a lot of focus on working with communities or hands-on building. And I think that's why maybe around some 50 volunteers from outside joined hands with us in not just designing, but also building the school. And of course, parents from within the community, though I think this whole notion of community architecture is also very romanticized, because if we have, let's say, a cleanliness drive in our own neighborhood, how many of us will be able to take out time to be a part of such an activity? So here also parents were very hard pressed for time, because they are at the fields every day, and then they have to go to the sabzi mandi. But whenever that was possible, they joined hands, and some of the students as well, because the building processes were quite simple, which were taught by the craftsmen within the community. So Nagendraji, who taught us how to split bamboo and weave bamboo. But here I am getting into details already, so let me go ahead. So just some pictures showing this process. That Shubham, who's an architect, that's Naresh, who was the main community leader in the project. And this is how the building process looked like. So just a compilation of the different things that went into it. But after a year, the school had to be dismantled because of land ownership issues. And when the school staff could not find an alternate location within the same neighborhood, within the same area, after a few months, they requested that maybe some other NGO can sort of adopt the school and rebuild it in any other place where children might be able to do with such a school. So this NGO called the Child Trust stepped in at that moment, and the school was relocated. Now this was, we had built the school in about 3 weeks in the summer of 2017, and then the school was dismantled in 2018. So the relocation happened around the end of 2018, and the school was rebuilt in 2019. So this is a dismantling process which took place in 2 days in the middle of the summer, and then it was stored for a few months in a night shelter, which the government has built there, and relocated to a village called Kulesra in Greater Noida and rebuilt there. The materials changed a bit because of the new location, and we also decided, with the director of the Child Trust, we decided to perhaps learn from the local crafts and also sort of incorporate them into the design of the school. So you can see this charpai weave, which also makes the school look very beautiful. The locals take a lot of sense of pride. Because of the materials which have been used is what I'd like to think, and what we have been told. And the school has also gained a bit of recognition recently, and I think that's because of the charpai weave and how it looks. So the school for us was the first step, like I said. And we realized very quickly that it's really a temporary solution, right? And it's a band-aid if you think about it. But it's not really addressing the root of the problem, which is that farmers are being evicted, and why are they being removed from there in the first place? So we started looking at the plans for the Yamuna. We started understanding the bigger picture. We started understanding it through a policy point of view, because we realized it's just not enough to think like a designer, think like an architect. And so we started looking at the extent of farmlands on the floodplains. And the earliest imagery from Google Earth helped us realize that they were covering half of the floodplains in 2000, which dwindled in 2010. And now till 2020, it's reduced to only about 3,000 hectares, which is 1/3 of our floodplains. So it's a huge loss to the city. There is the farms are responsible, the farmers are responsible for food production in the city, and at the same time they are being removed when the rest of the world is talking about urban farming. So these are the questions which started coming up, and we went into in-depth research in terms of legal developments from 1949, when the Farmers Cooperative was formed, which allowed the farmers to farm there in 5-year leases. Till today, what are the different developments that have taken place in terms of policy and planning, and what that has resulted into on ground. And this research is out there on our website, if you'd like to have a look. And then it was important for us to understand what are the different plans that the government has for the river. So this is the Zone O plan. Delhi has different zones, and the master plan, the zone for Yamuna, Yamuna and the floodplains is Zone O. And then the other plans by DDA, the structural plan, and then this plan which shows the different biodiversity parks that the government wants to build. And so the reason the farms are being removed and the farmers are being removed is that the government wants to build these biodiversity parks and wants to build jogging tracks and cycling tracks for the rest of us. And we realized there's not a lot of information in the public domain. And so we had to file for RTIs. This was Anubhav Pradhan, who's an academic who we collaborate closely with. And in response to his RTI queries, what he got were these black and white Xeroxes of the different parts of the Yamuna Riverfront Development Plan. Even now, we don't have the entire plan that we can understand what's going to happen in this area in the future. And it's really like a jigsaw puzzle. The different parts that we've got, we have sort of like rotated them and applied them to understand what's going to happen where. So you can see this near the D&D flyover. The digging for this part has already begun. And then this is Bela Estate. And this concerns us very intimately because these 5 areas that you see, the 5 boundaries, these are the 5 villages. These are the communities that we work with. And for us, all of this is really like, if you're talking about research, this is really like detective work. Because you have to just put all the clues together and you have to, connect the dots and fill the gaps, because all of this information it's so obscure. It's almost like the government is trying to make it hard for us to find it and make sense of it. And so that's what the work has looked like. And of course, a journalist managed to get the best sort of data. So we have been able to find a bit higher resolution images of this part, which is Bera Estate, which then we superimpose to see what's going to come next. And so when you look at it, now this is the top part of Bela Estate, this part. So I'm looking at this northern part right now. So if you look at it, this is the Golden Jubilee Park. And if some of you will remember, if you are from Delhi, this is where Yamuna Pushta used to be before it was evicted and resettled to the fringes of the city. Sapta, Gevra, Narela, Bhavana, much has been written on it. And so now it's a manicured park. This is the Swan Jayanti Park, the Golden Jubilee Park. And these are the farms which are there today. And so if you look at it, you can see that they coexist. They kind of seamlessly blend into each other. And this is not by design though, this is just by chance. And these farms are now going to be removed next. But it does make you wonder, why does it have to be parks versus farms? Why can't it be both? I mean, in any case, parks are also green spaces and definitely are going to use up more resources and not contribute the way that the farms are going to contribute. And cities across the world are talking about urban farming. It's become such a buzzword. So why are we hell-bent on removing farming within our city, especially especially when it's indigenous farming. It is urban farming which is being done the right way. Meaning to say, today when we talk about urban farming, it's understood as gardening on terraces or vertical farms. But this is farming as a resource on tracts of land. And I think we need to rethink farming to integrate it into our future visions of the city. And I'm really afraid that, or most likely this is going to happen, that they remove the farms and the farmers, and in the future, this idea gets imported, from Europe, saying, oh, we need to have urban farming, and farming comes back. But then it will be farming for you and me, and the farmers will be long gone by then. So how can we stop this is something we have been trying to work on since we built the school. And so we've been working on these sort of visions, collective visions, but giving them, this sort of a form to cater to the bourgeois aesthetics, if you will. And so we've come up with these sort of combined visions in consultation with different farming groups there, in which we want to show that it's not so hard to imagine, farms and the kind of public spaces you want to have, and jogging tracks, if you will. And if you look at it in terms of a plan, and landscape architect Kush has helped us create this, it's possible to have tracts of farms as well as, the public spaces and the parks that you want to have, and the other sort of biodiversity zones that DDA has in mind. So we presented this vision to DDA and to NIUA, who have been formulating the next master plan for Delhi, Delhi's 2041 plan. They have been working on for the last 2 years, and the draft was out just last week. And these are the sort of the demands or the principles that we went with as a part of this civil society campaign called Maybe Delhi. Who has been, as a part of the campaign, we all have been trying to make sure that this time in the master plan, the groups who are typically left out of these planning processes, they are heard, and their demands and their concerns are taken into account. Now, the draft has come out last week, and we're all going through it, combing through it. And so we will be talking about, what it means exactly over the coming days. But we are happy to see that one aspect of what we had shared, what we had suggested, what we had asked for is there. So there's this one line in the entire master plan which says specific locations may be identified for permitting agriculture in the floodplains. So I think this is a huge step, especially because in the past, the master plans have talked about concretizing the river or building a Disneyland sort of amusement park. So I think this is definitely a good step, but what does it mean in terms of implementation remains to be seen, especially when you look at the land use plan itself, this colorful diagram which shows different land uses based on residential, commercial, etc. And on the floodplains, it shows the farmlands, the farms as just blank space with this polka dot hash that you see. And the green areas are going to be landscaped areas. And this is exactly where the farmers are. This is where the farming clusters are. You can see Akshardham here has been removed from the floodplains because obviously it's not on the floodplains anymore. And a few other things like that. I'm not going to get into those details. So we have been looking at the previous Zono in the master plan from 2021 and the new Zono in 2041 master plan, which is now differentiated into Zone 1 and Zone 2. And it's very important to look at the boundaries, because when planners draw these lines on maps, they don't realize that these lines are passing through neighborhoods. They're passing through someone's home, which will be removed, depending on whether you're on this side of the line or that side. And there is no GIS map of zone or boundary. So what we can only do is superimpose it and to the best of our ability, try to guess where the line would be passing. And so that's why it's also become very important for us to create maps, because top-down mapping that DDA and other authorities have been doing haven't shown farmers on the maps. And it's very easy to remove what is not on the map. How will you miss something which never existed? And so that's why it's very important to create these counter maps to show that there are people on the ground and to create these maps with them. So this is something we are working on with the Basti Suraksha Manch, which is made up of community leaders from different bastis. And this is something we were planning to start before the second wave hit. So now, most likely we can start next week, which means data collection on ground by members of Basti Suraksha Manch with the farmers on ground. And we have divided ourselves into these different areas. So starting with the Yamuna Khadar area, to then be shared in the public domain, to then be shared with the policymakers. So now I'm going to move on to my second process. I hope I have enough time. I need 10 more minutes. So images like this have become really common now since the pandemic has become a part of our lives, right? Social distancing has become a common term. So that was a park in the US, this is a street in New Zealand. And so there's been a lot of talk about making a city cycle friendly, pedestrian friendly, more space for cycles, more space for pedestrians. How do we come together while still maintaining 6 feet distance? Now, some of these strategies have been top down, enforced by the municipalities, the authorities, and some of these have been self-organized. This is the case from Kerala. A lot of these social distancing norms are focused on people, who are going to restaurants and want to occupy public space. But what about the people whose livelihoods depend on the public space? So our street vendors, for example. And so it was very important for us to then start looking at how cities across the world are creating social distancing strategies to ensure that markets can open, and what are the safety provisions for vendors and the customers. So examples from Myanmar, from Indonesia, from Ghana, Somalia. These were important for us to understand what to do back home here in India. And so we've been working, again, as a part of the Maybe Delhi campaign with organizations that work with the street vendors and market associations like Vigo, Jan Pahal, Seva, and other design organizations like City Sabha. And we've been working with them in figuring out ways we could support street vendors in self-organizing themselves to follow social distancing norms. Now, this was in June, July last year, when the city had started opening up. Cities had started opening up, but the weekly markets were still not allowed in cities like Delhi. So what we were trying to do is create these sort of pilot projects to convince the authorities that the weekly markets can also open, and it's possible to display COVID appropriate behavior, which will take care of the safety of vendors and customers alike. So this we were doing with the different hawker associations in Delhi, led by Jan Pahal, led by Seva. And we started looking at very simple strategies like spray painting, signs for public awareness, just figuring out what 6 feet apart really means, 3 feet apart for customers. I think for architects it's very simple to visualize, if there are going to be 200 vendors on this road, then if everyone needs to be 6 feet apart, it means this. But on ground, what does it translate to? Because that means that some vendors will not get to ply because you need more space within the same sort of stretch. So how do you make sure that everyone gets their turn? And so for that, you have to draw these layouts out on the ground. Role play becomes an important part of prototyping then. And so we created these sort of visuals as WhatsApp forwards, which could be circulated around in Hindi as well. And these are different simple strategies that I had talked about. And after this, I don't know if it was directly because of this, I would like to think it was one of the contributing factors. The weekly markets were allowed to open in Delhi. This was in between August and September. And then we went on to work further with this organization Vigo, which is Women in Informal Employment, Governing and Organizing. On creating these manuals for market associations across Indian cities, where we could share these design guidelines with them. We could also share the health guidelines and also information on rights of street vendors. Because we have a progressive act which has been introduced in 2014 called the Street Vendors Act, but it's been implemented across very few states in India. And the government, the governments at different levels still have to make sure that the street vendors know about this act and how it protects them. So how could we support in that process? How could we help simplify this very complex sort of a policy, this act, into very simple, easy to understand concepts. So for our storytelling techniques, we have these mascots, Leena and Bindu. Forgot to introduce them. So they came up, we created them. This designer in our team, Anshul, created them when we were putting out building manuals. Most of our designs are open source on our website, and we decided to make building manuals so that the steps would be there and the cost would be there for all the different structures that we have worked on. And also, when we started looking at mascots for inspiration, we realized most of the mascots are male when it comes to building manuals, which really annoyed us. So we had to create female mascots. But yeah, I think we need to represent all genders. Our mascots are also developing. I will show you. So coming back to the manual, And so we also had to understand first who are the different kinds of street vendors and what are the different kinds of trades. So we started looking at the different typologies because that's what architects like doing. So mobile vendors, pop-up vendors who kind of set up every day and then pack it up and take it home with them, or part of it they leave behind. And then fixed shops. And so all of these different typologies have been represented in the manual, which is also in Hindi. And subject to support will be translated into regional languages over the coming time. And user feedback was an important part in developing this manual, simply to make sure that all the visuals and the icons which have been used were understood and were not just abstract sort of icons. And so finally, this is the manual, the posters, and then we also put up some posters in the weekly market themselves, just public awareness signages. This has been designed in collaboration with City Sabha. And so the mascots are evolving. As you see now, Leena and Bindu have been customized for the campaign, and there's a new mascot, Rumi. And finally, another sort of output, if you will, of this entire process has been mapping the weekly markets, because the more we learned about them, the more we realized that the system of the self-organized system of setting them up is so creative, it's so effective, which has been perfected over years of putting them up and dismantling them within a day, because weekly markets run on different days of the week, right? So we had to put it out there in the public domain. So Nishtha from our team has created this little zine for public circulation. And at the same time, we started mapping all the weekly markets in Delhi. Now, Delhi has a rich heritage of weekly markets, which is its rural legacy. There are over 500 weekly markets in Delhi. I don't know if any other city in India has so many weekly markets, out of which 272 markets are recognized by the authorities. And so through information shared by Jan Pehel, from all the different zones, we were able to map them. And this is an open source map on our website. And I think it's very important how maps can really help in visibilizing informal work. We're also working with Vigo on the work done by domestic workers and waste pickers, and all of these occupations are invisible in our city. And maps, because usually maps leave them out, we have to speak a language. We have to speak the same language to create these counter narratives, right? And so it's very important to visualize them, to show that a large part of the city is comprised of them, and their contribution to the city, to then help in recognition and representation of that trade. At the same time, you have to also make sure that you're not putting anyone at risk. That by giving the locations of certain groups, you're not making them more vulnerable. So you have to also take a decision on at which point you want to share it as an open source map, like the weekly markets, and at which point you cannot do that, such as with the waste picking communities. And finally, this is the last part of my presentation. This is a project called Missing Basti, and this is linked to the first few slides that I was showing you, the SEP students' work. So this was a workshop we did in 2017, where we were mapping the evictions in the city, which mostly go undocumented, unheard, and we felt it was very important to put it out there. This was again in collaboration with people like Frederique Thonke, who's an architect, Mayank Chandak, who designed the website, and supported by social workers like Shakil from Basti Suraksha Manch, Doug, who's a human rights lawyer. And just to again skip the details, I just want to get to the final part, because finally again snowballed into a larger movement. And today this is a public project comprised of made up by a huge collective, where all the evictions in Delhi from 1990 to today are there on this website. So there have been over 300 evictions over the last 3 decades, over the last 30 years, which we've been able to put together. And who are we? It's a collective made up of academics like Gautam Bhan and Veronique Dupont, who are primarily the ones who gave all this data. And I would say give it away, because most academics hold on to their data, but it's so important to put it out there, to create it as an open source archive. And then lots of filmmakers join forces with us, lots of designers. It's based on the on-ground work of, again, people like Shakil from Basti Suraksha Manch and organizations like Housing and Land Rights Network. And it's, I really think of it as a negative print of a city, because you see all the missing places, right? And it's very important to document this loss. It's very important to show the presence of this absence, if you will, because how else will you plan for a city unless you acknowledge what has been removed and why it's important to question it and to challenge it. So in conclusion, I just want to highlight the strength of collectives. I think most of the work that we are able to do is because we do it as collectives in collaboration with people that we learn from. And I think we call our practice a slow practice simply because we don't really see them as projects, but as relationships which develop over time, with trust, like Kush had mentioned. And these are relationships with the people we work with and the people we collaborate with. And I think that's really the strength of the work that we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Swati, for a very comprehensive talk. And I've been following your work for a long time and teaching in an architecture school, and that has an urban design program. It has always been, a very piquant question, I guess. So I've studied urban planning and studied architecture, and they work at very different scales, as you know. And I was just thinking about that too when I was looking at your what you presented. So you are an architect, and you're working at a very at the grassroots level with communities and building structures for them which they need in their everyday lives. On the other hand, you're dealing with the scale of the city, the master plan of Delhi, right? And then you're looking at the entire. So how do you reconcile? Because I always find that challenging in an urban design studio, for instance, and students are always tussling with where do they find the middle ground with this different scales at which they need to study the city and its social life and all the other layers as well. I was going to ask you about a couple of things. First of all, the terrain of actors themselves, at one level you're dealing directly with communities, and then the other end it's the master plan, which is the entire city. So it's like really opens up. I mean, there's so many people involved in that then. So how do you, in your work, and how do you even start to get, as you talked about collectives, of course, but how do you even get around working around that entire scale, and scale difference?
Yeah, that's really the open secret, working in collaborations. I think there is no other way because, if single-handedly we try to do this, there's no way we can do it. And so working at different scales with different people, different groups is the only way you can manage to sort of, traverse these different scales. And I think it's really important. It is challenging, but I think over time, you also your mind becomes a bit more nimble at, switching between these scales, which we are not taught in college. And it took me many, many years. Even now, I feel burnt out very often. But at the same time, I think it's important because otherwise, I think, first of all, grassroots work is very important. If we didn't do that, then that's the crux of our work, that's the spirit of our work, and that's where I think all the real sort of answers and processes come from. But at the same time, if we cannot work at a policy level, then it just stays where it is. So for it to be to be influencing the conversations at a city level, at a national level, it's important that someone is making this link. So right now we are doing it, but it could be anyone. There's so many people associated with our work who also, I think, start doing something similar in their own spheres. So the work also grows that way. They write about it, they research on it. But I think that's really the only way, linking the two together, policy and architecture. And I feel policy should be taught at an architectural level. Like BR should have a bit of policy interwoven. How can you design markets if you don't know about the Street Vendors Act? How can you talk about the river if you're not talking about the people who thrive on that ecosystem, right? Or thrive or support that ecosystem, which is who are the fisher folks, the farmers, the cattle herders. The list goes on and on. So I think it's really helpful to think this way, and it's possible, but it's very challenging. Yeah.
Thank you so much. More questions in the end, of course. So we move to our next speaker.